2013, Jim Stauffer's mother finally passed away from Alzheimer's disease at the age of 74. Her doctors told Jim that her disease had mutated in a way they had not seen before, and they asked if he'd be willing to donate her body so they could study her brain. Jim felt like his mother would want him to say yes, and so he agreed. But for a variety of administrative reasons, the neurologists couldn't actually accept Jim's mother's body. At this point, Jim was really bought into the idea that his mother's brain was going to help other patients, and so while he couldn't donate her body to these neurologists, he could donate her body to the Biological Resource Center in Phoenix, Arizona. This center would take dead bodies and then extract parts of them for scientific research, and then would cremate the rest of them and return the ashes to the family. Jim gave his mother's body to the center, and when he filled out the paperwork, he indicated that her brain should be extracted for Alzheimer's research. After filling out the paperwork, Jim left, and 10 days later, he received a wooden box in the mail that contained his mother's ashes. There was no note attached to the box explaining exactly what was done to his mother's body, but Jim assumed they did what he asked. A year later, that Biological Resource Center was raided by the FBI after accusations they were selling these donated bodies for profit. During the FBI's investigation, they uncovered that yes, the center had been doing that and had sold at least 20 bodies to the US Army for various experiments, and one of the bodies that was sold was Jim's mother. She was sold for $5,893. The FBI told Jim she had not been used for Alzheimer's research. Instead, she had been strapped to this device that resembled a chair and then had a bomb detonated underneath her. The Army was trying to understand the effects on the human body when a vehicle is hit by an IED. The ashes Jim received in that wooden box he got in the mail were only from his mother's hand. The rest of her body was unrecoverable. Also, during this FBI investigation, they found inside the center there was a man's body on the wall with a female head sewed onto it. It appeared to be a trophy. Jim, along with 19 other families, sued the center, and finally, in 2019, they were awarded $58 million in damages. The center no longer is in operation. In 2004, Mitch was in his final semester at a college in Louisiana when he met another senior, a wonderful young lady named Kayla. From the instant he saw her, he knew he was in love. She played hard to get at first, but after several months, he won her over. After graduation, the pair stayed in Louisiana and moved in together while they got their careers off the ground. 2 years later, the pair got married, and almost immediately, Kayla got pregnant. At the time, Mitch's career was really starting to take off, which allowed Kayla to stay at home and take some time off. By the time their daughter was born, Mitch was making so much money that Kayla decided to just stay home and be a full-time mom. A couple years later, Kayla got pregnant again, and by the time their daughter was 2 years old, they had their son. Mitch adored his children. Every morning before he went to work, he would sneak into their room and he would watch them sleep, and then in the evenings they would have these big family sit-down meals and then play games together until bedtime. Mitch's life was perfect. Shortly after his son's birth, Mitch was lounging on the couch in his TV room when he noticed out of the corner of his eye the red lamp in the corner of the room. It just looked funny. It was almost like the light itself was blurry, but when he looked a little bit closer at it, the entire lamp looked blurry. And so Mitch looked around the room and nothing else was blurry. He rubbed his eyes and looked back over at this lamp and it was still blurry. He turned the TV off and walked over to the lamp, and even though he was right in front of it, the lamp was still blurry. And Mitch didn't have bad eyesight, and so he's thinking, is there something wrong with me? Am I having a stroke? Do I have an aneurysm? Is there some sort of illness here that's making me see this lamp blurry when it's really not? But Mitch told himself he was healthy and that whatever this was, it was an anomaly and nothing to worry about. And so he went back over to the couch, turned the TV back on, and tried to ignore the lamp. But as he was watching TV, out of his peripheral vision, he couldn't help but notice this weird blurry lamp. And so finally, he turned the TV off again, and he turned to look at this lamp. And now, in addition to being blurry, it appeared to be upside down. Now Mitch was genuinely concerned that there was something wrong with him, because again, nothing else in the entire room was blurry or upside down. It was just this lamp. And so a few minutes later, his wife and his kids came home, and Mitch decided he would not tell them about this lamp. He didn't want to alarm them. He figures he will get to the bottom of this blurry lamp, and then he will tell his wife wife and kids. And so that night, the family has a sit-down meal, and then afterwards they play some games together, and then everybody goes upstairs and goes to sleep. But after everyone had gone to sleep, Mitch was just laying in bed thinking about this lamp. And so finally, he snuck out of his bed and went downstairs to the TV room, and he sat on the couch, and he just stared at this lamp. And for hours and hours, he just fixated himself on this lamp, watching it kind of morph around and turn upside down and get blurrier and blurrier by the second. The next day, Kayla found Mitch lying on the couch, passed out, and she asked him if he was okay. And again, Mitch didn't tell her about this lamp that was still blurry. He just told her that he wasn't feeling well and he was not going to go to work that day. But Mitch didn't go to work for 3 more days. He just sat on the couch and stared at this lamp. And Kayla obviously picked up on this strange behavior and kept poking and prodding to get more information about what was going on, but Mitch never told her the truth about this lamp. He just kept telling her he felt sick. She urged him to go see a doctor, but Mitch told her it would be fine, he'd get better. And then over time, as this lamp continued to morph and get bigger and get stranger and stranger, Mitch suddenly was unable to respond to his wife. He became totally unresponsive. And so obviously his wife became desperate and called the doctor. And as she's on the phone with the doctor trying to get advice about what to do, Mitch realizes the lamp is now growing in leaps and bounds. And before long, the lamp is the entire size of the room, and all he can see is the red color of this lamp. And then Mitch starts to hear these voices, these screams coming from somewhere in the distance, and then he feels this blinding pain in his head. And then he opens his eyes and he looks up and he sees he's laying on the sidewalk next to one of the buildings at his college in Louisiana. And surrounding him is this crowd of people with wide eyes that are staring at him. Mitch had no idea what was going on, and so he naturally just began scanning the crowd, looking for Kayla and his kids to try to figure out, how he got here. But before he could ask any questions and before he could find his wife and kids, a police officer ran through the crowd, picked him up and ran him over to his police car, put him in the back, and then began driving away. And so while Mitch is in the back of this police car, he turns to the officer and he says, "What's going on?" And the officer would tell him he was attacked by a huge college football player. He got hit in the head and he fell backwards and he hit his head again and he fell unconscious. Mitch asked the officer where his wife and kids were, and the cop said he had no idea. And that's when it clicked for Mitch. The lamp wasn't real. Neither was his wife, neither was his daughter, neither was his son, neither was his life. For the past 10 years, it was all a hallucination while he was unconscious after getting attacked. Mitch was brought to the hospital where he would make a full physical recovery, but after being released, he was horribly depressed, and he had to get intense therapy to basically grieve for the loss of his family that never existed. These days, Mitch says he can barely remember what his family even looked like, but periodically in his dreams, he will catch a glimpse of his son in his peripheral vision, and his son is perpetually 5 years old, and he's trying to talk to his father, but Mitch can never understand what he says. In 2007, Brett Ryan was a charming 26-year-old man living in Toronto, Canada. He was known as an extremely friendly guy who was always smiling ear to ear with his trademark grin. In his spare time, he could be found at children's hospitals reading to sick kids, or at the community center volunteering as an umpire for Little League baseball games. But behind his seemingly perfect exterior, behind the scenes, Brett was struggling. He had to move back in with his parents after dropping out of college and racking up over $60,000 of debt. While his friends graduated college and went on to begin their careers in medicine and finance and education, Brett was only able to get a job as a part-time house painter. Brett felt like he had a lot of potential that he was squandering, but he felt like the debt that he had racked up was really his roadblock between him and the life he was supposed to have. And so instead of working hard and making some money to pay down his debt, he decided to come up with an absurd get-rich-quick scheme that actually kind of worked. On October 20th of that year, Brett walked into a bank near his home, and he had hospital bandages wrapped around his head and his face, and his left arm was in a sling. Then he walked up to one of the tellers and he handed her a note that just said, "I have a gun underneath this sling, give me $2,000. And the teller very quickly complied, and she gave him a little over $1,000. That was all the money she had. And Brett took the money, turned around, and calmly walked out of the bank. And he got in his car and he got home, and he was totally exhilarated, and he's half expecting the police to just show up at his front door, but they never did. He was never caught. and after that, he was hooked. For the next 8 months, Brett robbed a dozen other banks in the area, stealing almost $30,000. He became so confident in his ability to steal without getting caught that he began dressing up in these ridiculous outfits that included this huge, obviously fake beard, and in fact, the media dubbed him the fake bearded bandit. The reason Brett wasn't getting caught is because the police would get his fingerprints at the crime scene, but because he did not have a criminal record, his prints were not in the database. And so the police basically just had to set up and hope to catch this guy in the act. And in the summer of 2008, they finally would catch the fake bearded bandit. At Brett's trial, dozens of his friends wrote letters of support to the judge saying that Brett was actually a great guy, that this was a product of desperation and a total break from his normal character. And some of the organizations that he volunteered with did the same thing, writing letters to the judge saying what a meaningful contributor Brett was to the community. When Brett spoke at his trial, he was incredibly remorseful and said he had allowed his debt to get totally out of control and that admittedly he had not handled it well. And so the judge took all of this into account, all the letters of support and Brett's overall appearance in court, and he decided that this was indeed a break from character and that Brett was actually a very promising young man and that he did not deserve the harshest penalty. And so Brett was sentenced to just under 4 years, which considering the crime was a very lenient sentence. And so Brett went to jail, but then less than 2 years later in 2010, he was granted parole and allowed to move back in with his parents. And his parents would say he was a changed man ready for a fresh start. But Brett would find life outside of jail was exponentially harder now that he was an ex-con. It was extremely hard to get a job, which meant he had no income, and without an income, he couldn't pay down all those debts he had, and so he had to declare bankruptcy. As for life at home, it was very difficult. Brett's family was very embarrassed about what he had done, and when Brett moved back home, it was obvious that all the neighbors were gossiping constantly about their family. And so Brett and his family actually moved to another Toronto neighborhood just to get away from all of that. But once they settled into this new neighborhood, Brett really knuckled down and decided he was going to get his life together and he was going to do it all on his own. And so he applied to dozens and dozens of jobs all over the place, and finally he was able to get some low-paying work in retail. It wasn't great, but it was a start. And so Brett began working countless hours at this really low-paying job, and his parents noticed how hard he was working to try to get his life back together, and so they decided they would help him out financially so he could re-enroll in college and finish his degree in biophysics. While Brett was in school, he met a woman named Kristen who had a full-time job and lived in this beautiful home, and by and large, she had the life that he wished he could have. And the two of them quickly fell in love, and Brett told her about his criminal past as the fake bearded bandit, and she accepted him, and she didn't judge him, and she said, "I still love you, I still want to be with you." 2 years later, Brett moved out of his parents' house and into Kristen's house, and for once in his life, he felt like his life was going the way it should be. Then, a year later, tragedy struck when Brett's father passed away, and suddenly Brett had to go to his mother's house all the time to try to help her out. And his mother was very appreciative of the time he was spending with her, and so she actually began paying him for the work he was doing around the home. And considering Brett was a broke college student, this was a huge help, and in many ways, it really brought Brett and his mother together. A year later, in 2015, Brett proposed to Kristen, and she said yes. But at the same time, school was getting overwhelming for Brett, and he dropped out. But he was too embarrassed to tell his fiance or his family because everybody thought he was on the right path and he didn't want to explain why he had dropped out, and so he just pretended to still be in school. Then in the spring of 2016, when Brett should have been graduating, he got a very lucky break when a big tech firm in Toronto offered him a job. On paper, Brett should not have gotten this job. He wasn't qualified, he didn't have a degree. But in getting this job, Brett was able to tell his fiance and his family that he had just graduated college, and that was how he was getting this job. His family and his fiance were a little confused why they weren't invited to his graduation ceremony, but nonetheless, they were very excited for him and they took him out and they celebrated. Then, a week after Brett accepted this job, the tech firm rescinded their offer when they discovered Brett was in fact the fake bearded bandit. Now, Brett panicked because this job represented this perfect piece to his web of lies that allowed him to pretend he had his degree and that everything was so great, and so he couldn't possibly tell his fiance and his family that he didn't get this job. And so he decided he would just lie and pretend to go to this job every day. Meanwhile, Brett's mom began bragging to all of her new neighbors about her son Brett, who had really turned his life around. He graduated from college, he got this great job, he's got a beautiful fiance, he's got this wonderful home. Everything is just going great for Brett. At first, Brett was able to push the guilt out of his subconscious and just live this ridiculous lie, but as his wedding day approached, the weight of all these lies and the guilt he felt, it became overwhelming, and practically speaking, he was worried about how he would explain to his new wife why he had no income despite having this full-time job. And so he went to his mother and he told her the truth about dropping out of college, about not getting that job offer, and then he said, "Can you keep all of this a secret? And can you give me a whole bunch of money so I can keep living this lie?" And she said, "No. And in fact, you need to tell your fiance that you're lying or I will." This was the worst case scenario for Brett, and one that he was not prepared for. He really thought his mom would be like, "Yep, let's do it, let's keep this thing going." But when she didn't, he didn't really know what to do. He believed if Kristen found out the truth, she would leave him and that would ruin his perfect life. And so he decided he would not tell Kristen. Instead, he would kill his mother. Because he was an ex-con, he couldn't buy a firearm. However, he could buy a crossbow. And so he ordered his crossbow, he watched a couple YouTube videos about how to operate it, and then on one of his trips to his mother's house to help out, he stashed the crossbow and some arrows on a shelf in her garage. Then, when he got home, he began designing these bizarre contraptions that were built out of fans and pulleys and broomsticks that, when turned on, would move around the room and click on his keyboard and turn his phone off and on. It was designed to help him build an alibi when he was out committing murder. His devices would be turning on and off again, giving the impression that he was at home the whole time. On August 25th, 2017, all his preparations were done. He woke up early that morning and he began getting ready for his fake job. At the same time, Kristen was also getting ready for her real job, and then at 7:30, when they were both ready to go, they hopped in their respective cars and headed out for the day. But Brett slowed down at the end of the street and waited for Kristen to disappear around the corner. Brett turned back, went back into his house. He went up to his room and turned on all of his bizarre alibi contraptions that he made sure were turning off and on his devices correctly. And after a while, once he was confident these devices would work, he hopped in his car and he drove over to his mother's house. He got there around 10 a.m. He walked inside and his mother was sitting in the kitchen, and he approached her about changing her mind about telling the truth to Kristen. But his mother was staunch and she said, "No, I'm going to tell her before your wedding unless you do." And so their exchange got really heated, and before long, his mother actually called one of his older brothers, Chris, to come to her house and talk to Brett to defuse this situation. Brett was furious and stormed out of the kitchen. He grabbed the door that led into the garage, and he stormed in to try to get his crossbow off the shelf. But his mother followed after him. Now, the crossbow had not been loaded when he put it up on that shelf, and Brett was not very good at loading it, and it would take several seconds to actually do it. So he's thinking to himself, when I pull that down and begin loading it, she's going to see the weapon and she's going to run outside before I can get to her. And so when he reached up, he didn't grab the crossbow, he grabbed the arrows. And in a swift motion, he pulled them down, re-gripped them like a knife, faced his mother, and began attacking her viciously. She fell backwards and a shelf actually landed on top of her, pinning her to the ground. At which point Brett seized the opportunity. He got up, grabbed a piece of nylon, he wrapped it around her neck, and he suffocated her. As soon as she was dead, Brett pulled her out from under the shelf and dragged her to the side of the garage. He put the shelf back up, and then he began loading his crossbow because he knew Chris, his older brother that his mother had called, was going to be here soon. And so he hid behind the door inside of the garage and just waited. And at some point he heard Chris's car pull into the driveway. Chris walked into the house, he yelled for his mom, he yelled for Brett, but he didn't get a response. And eventually Chris made his way to the open door leading into the garage. He stepped inside, and as soon as he did, Brett silently got up behind him and he fired one shot directly into the back of his neck, killing him instantly. Brett took Chris's body and piled it on top of his mother's, and as he was putting a tarp over top of them, he heard another car pulling into the driveway. It was his younger brother, AJ. Now, at this point, Brett knows he is in too deep and he has to finish the job, and so he doesn't have time to load his crossbow, and so again, he just grabs one of the arrows and he walks outside and he sees AJ getting out of his car and he runs up to him and he jabs the arrow into his brother's neck. And so they're fighting in the driveway. Meanwhile, Brett's other brother, Lee, who's actually in the house sleeping, he wakes up to the sound of this commotion outside in the driveway. He looks out the window and he sees his brothers fighting, and so he runs downstairs and he comes outside, and at this point AJ is laying on the ground and he's basically motionless, and Brett is standing over him, and Brett turns and he sees Lee in the doorway and he runs off after him. Lee sees his brother running at him and just turns and runs into the house, but he only gets a few feet before Brett jumps on top of them, and then the two of them have this vicious fight where Brett is trying to stab him with the arrows, and they're basically both fighting for their lives. And at some point, after Lee suffered several very deep cuts, he manages to throw Brett off of him, and he runs outside to his brother AJ, who's now crawled all the way to the street. And in fact, AJ had managed to flag down a neighbor and got his neighbor to call the police. As for Brett, after Lee had managed to fight him off and ran outside, he knew he was done. And so instead of chasing his brother outside, he put his arrow down and he walked into the kitchen. He opened up the fridge, he took a bottle of water out, he left the fridge door open and just walked out to the front steps and sat down and drank his water while he waited for police to show up. When they did arrive, his brother AJ died before they could save him. As police were arresting Brett, he kind of casually said, "Yeah, I should have taken AJ to the hospital, I could have saved him. And the other guys in the garage are dead, crossbow to the head. It was me." In court, Brett was extremely remorseful and pled guilty to all of his charges. The judge told Brett that he was appreciative of the fact that he was taking full ownership of his heinous crimes, and that in many ways he was a victim too, a victim of this huge web of lies that Brett just couldn't get out from under. But nonetheless, Brett was given 3 consecutive life terms, one for each of the murders he committed. The only surviving family member, Lee, the brother who was attacked last and managed to run outside and escape Brett, he said that his life was shattered that day and that he can barely go outside because of his extreme post-traumatic stress. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come over and play Mortal Kombat with you, and when they show up, play real Mortal Kombat with them and uppercut them into the ceiling. So full disclosure, this is not my personal story, but in order to do this story justice, it has to be told in the first person. So I am simply an actor. I was once on a US military ship in the wardroom, which is the officer's lounge, when the operations officer came inside. This guy was the definition of not a morning person. He was bleary-eyed, he kind of stumbled in, he was like a zombie holding a bagel. He sits down in front of me, he's barely conscious, and he starts gnawing on his bagel, and I'm sitting with my back to the outboard side of the ship, so that's the outside of the ship behind me, and there's a porthole right next to my head where the sun is coming through, and it's hitting this officer directly on his face. And so the officer's looking up at the sun, he's kind of squinting and blocking the sun from his face, and I'm looking at him expecting him to shift left or right to get out of the path of the sunlight. But instead, this officer slowly reaches for the phone on the wall, he brings it up to his head, and he goes, "Yeah, Bridge, this is Ops. I need you to adjust our path. Yeah, 156, yep, that's about right. Okay, all right, bye." After he hangs up with the bridge, I'm watching him and he hasn't moved. He's still just looking at the sunlight blazing in on his face. He's just squinting and looking up at it. And then all of a sudden, this port of sunlight just gradually begins to shift off of him and winds up on the wall right behind him where it stops. By ordering the bridge to change the ship's path just slightly, about 15 degrees, it's enough of a change to reposition the sun from his face. He literally redirected thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of people just because he was too lazy to move left or right. I'm in awe. I can't believe he's just done this, and for a second, I worry that he won't realize how unbelievably brilliant this was. And then as I'm looking at him, in between bites, he just looks up at me and smiles and goes back to eating his bagel. In November of 2006, Nintendo came out with a brand new gaming console called the Wii, and it was hugely popular and sold out almost completely right away. By the following January, it was still not on shelves in most places around the world, and so people were going crazy, spending unbelievable sums of money to try to get their hands on this system. A Sacramento, California radio station called KDND got a hold of one of these coveted systems and decided they would give it away during an on-air contest. The contest was going to be called Hold Your Wii for a Wii. And the premise of this contest was simple. The contestants would be given lots of water, and the person who held it the longest, i.e. they didn't urinate, would win the prize. Leading up to this contest, the radio station began promoting it really aggressively on air, and lots of people called in with concerns saying that drinking too much water can actually be deadly. But the station brushed these concerns off and said they were aware of them, and that all contestants would be signing a waiver, and so ultimately the station station was not responsible for what happened to them. On the morning of Friday, January 12th, 18 contestants showed up at the KDND radio station and they signed their waivers, although one of the contestants said the waiver only covered publicity issues, not health and safety concerns. One of the contestants was 28-year-old Jennifer Strange, who was a mother of 3, and she was trying to win this Wii for her kids. She, along with the others, after signing their waiver, were ushered into this room where they were handed 8-ounce water bottles. Every 15 minutes, they would be expected to finish that water bottle and then refill it and do it every 15 minutes. And if at any point they didn't completely finish their water bottle in time, or if they got up to use the bathroom, they would lose the contest. The contest started at 6:45 a.m., and by 8 a.m., after 5 bottles had been drank, a number of the contestants began pulling themselves out to use the bathroom. But the radio staff felt like this contest was going to take a really long time, and so they gave the remaining contestants, that included Jennifer, a larger bottle of water to drink from. Over the next several hours, all of the contestants, except for Jennifer and one other, had dropped out because it was just too painful. They had to go to the bathroom. Jennifer was heard on air saying it hurt so much, and one of the hosts laughed and said, "Well, do you need to lay down?" And then somebody piped up and said, "She can't even walk." And so everybody just kind of laughed and did nothing about it. Around this time, a nurse called into the radio station and very emphatically said what they were doing, this contest, was a really bad idea. You're gonna get someone killed from water intoxication. Water intoxication is also known as water poisoning, and in a nutshell, what happens is when you drink too much water, the water dilutes your bloodstream, it can cause swelling in your brain, and it can lead to coma and or death. The host, after hearing this concern, turned and yelled to the remaining contestants, "Hey, is anybody dying out there?" And then the host just kind of laughed and hung up on the nurse. A little while later, you can hear one of the hosts on air comment on how Jennifer's belly looked really strange. It had become totally distended and bloated, and they said it looked like she was pregnant. At some point, Jennifer and the other remaining contestant began vomiting, but instead of dropping out, they just continued to drink more water and did not go to the bathroom. But finally, it became too much for Jennifer to bear, and she dropped out of the contest and she relieved herself. For coming in second place, she received tickets to a Justin Timberlake concert. On her drive home, Jennifer began experiencing this horrific headache to the point where she was just sobbing uncontrollably. Through tears, she called one of her coworkers and said she just was not going to be able to come into work that day. Her head hurt too much. And so after she hung up, her coworker she had just spoken to was really concerned about her and called Jennifer's mother to let her know what was going on. And about an hour later, Jennifer's mother headed over to Jennifer's house to check on her, and she found Jennifer dead in her bathroom from water poisoning. The station was ultimately sued by Jennifer's family, and they were ordered to pay over $16 million in damages. In 2005, 57-year-old Steven Slevin was a physically healthy man, but mentally he was struggling. He was depressed and felt like his life didn't have any purpose anymore, and so in August of that year, he decided to just go on a road trip. He didn't know where he was going. He just felt like if I get out on the road and just go driving somewhere, I will feel better. And on this road trip, he eventually began drinking alcohol, and before long, he was swerving along the New Mexico highway, and a police officer saw his erratic driving and pulled him over. Once Steven failed his sobriety test, the police officer arrested him. Steven was brought to a local detention center where during his booking process, it was discovered that he had a history of mental illness. And so the officers, following that county's policy, segregated him from the rest of the general population in an effort to protect Steven from himself. They moved him into a padded cell on the first floor, they removed all of his clothing, and they put him in what's called a suicide smock, which looks like a big blanket wrapped around your upper body. And what it does is it keeps inmates warm and modest, but it also prevents them from balling up their clothes and creating a noose they could hurt themselves with. After a few days in this padded cell, Steven was moved to another, better cell that had a window, it had a shower, it had a toilet, and he was there for 2 weeks under strict medical observation. But at the end of those 2 weeks, for reasons that are not entirely clear, Steven, this mentally unstable man, was moved into solitary confinement to await trial for his DWI. Solitary confinement is a type of imprisonment where the inmate is shifted into a single-person cell and they are kept there nearly around the clock without any significant interaction with other people or other inmates. The psychological effects of solitary confinement are well documented and terrifying. Just 15 days into solitary can be enough to cause permanent psychological damage. Stephen's first few weeks in solitary were actually okay. He was allowed to write to his family, he was able to detox and reflect on his life. During those first few weeks, it was noted that Stephen was very polite in his very limited interaction with the officers that were dropping food off through the slot in his door. Also, when Stephen had a few minor medical issues, instead of throwing a fit, he just knocked on the inside of his door and waited patiently for someone to acknowledge him, which took a long time, but he never got frustrated or mad. But by January of 2006, so roughly 3 months into his solitary stint, Stephen had not had any updates on when his case was going to go to trial, and Stephen was starting to lose his grip on reality. He was having these severe panic attacks, and he was suffering from intense hallucinations. He desperately wanted to find out how much longer he was going to be kept in the cell, but nobody would tell him. He tried writing his letters to his family asking for help or asking them to try to get an update on his case, but when he went to literally write the letter, his hand shook so severely from the stress and anxiety that he literally couldn't write these letters. Starting that January, Stephen began spending the bulk of his day in the corner of his cell with his knees tucked up to his chest, rocking back and forth. He was allowed out of his cell a few times a month, but in April of that year, that stopped, and he almost never left his cell again. And without leaving his cell, Stephen was unable to bathe, and so his skin began developing fungus and began falling off, and his teeth began to rot. Finally, on May 8th, 2007, so 1 year and 8 months of being in solitary confinement, Stephen was transferred out of his cell to a behavioral institute in Las Vegas, Nevada. After bathing and shaving and cutting his hair and receiving proper medical treatment, he was back to his normal self within a couple of days. And while he was there, he had a chance to speak to a lawyer, and the lawyer would say the entire meeting, Stephen was just saying, "Where have I been?" And the lawyer said, you've been in solitary confinement awaiting trial. You've been there for almost 2 years. And to that, Stephen was shocked and literally didn't believe him. He actually couldn't remember that time in his life. It was like it had driven him crazy and he had completely repressed it from his memory. But when the lawyer told him about it, it began to come back into his mind, and he begged the lawyer to not let them send him back to solitary confinement. And his lawyer said, unfortunately, if that's where they're going to keep you, that's where they're going to keep you until you have your trial for this DWI, and unfortunately we have no idea when that trial is going to be. But stay strong, because it's bound to be soon if they've already transferred you to this institute. Stephen stayed at this institute for 2 weeks, and during that time he asked constantly about when his trial was going to happen, but nobody knew. And at the end of those 2 weeks, Stephen was abruptly taken out of his room, put in a van, driven back to New Mexico, and put back into his solitary confinement cell. And immediately Stephen began to deteriorate, and he begged the guards to not put him in the cell, but nobody was listening, and before long, the door had shut and he was all alone again. Within a couple of days, Stephen developed an abscess in one of his teeth, and he tried to get medical attention, but he didn't get it, and so he sat in the corner of his cell, and for 8 hours one day, he rocked back and forth and violently twisted and yanked and pulled on that tooth until he was able to rip it out of his head. Almost 2 months later, on June 22nd, 2007, Stephen's case was finally put before a judge, and the judge dismissed all of the charges. It's believed the judge found out about this horrible mistreatment of Stephen and took pity on him, but we'll never know. 3 days later, Stephen was released from jail and reunited with his family. He had been in solitary confinement for 2 years without so much as a hearing to tell him what was going on. He had essentially been forgotten about. He would go on to sue the county and win $15.5 million in damages. However, at the same time he's winning this case, he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer and given less than a year to live. It's unclear if he is alive today. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button some chips and guacamole, but replace the guacamole with wasabi. In 2008, 28-year-old Chris Smith was an up-and-coming star in the lead generation business. Lead generation is not a flashy business. Basically, you create these ads that are designed to generically help people with things like lowering their mortgage payments or reducing their credit card debt. And in these ads, you leave behind a 1-800 number for anybody interested to call. And the people that do call, their information is taken down, and then the lead generator, the person who made that ad, they sell that information to more mortgage brokers and debt consolidators and anybody else that wants access to that lead. Chris's ability to create these really compelling ads and get people to call said number was so good that it caught the attention of another up-and-comer in the lead generation space, a man by the name of Ed Shin. Ed worked for a lead generation company called LG Tech in Southern California, and Ed wound up hiring Chris to come onto their team as a consultant. Right away, Chris and Ed totally hit it off, despite being very different people. Chris was a surfer bro who wore flip-flops and t-shirts every day and never went to college. Ed was a very sharply dressed, college-educated father of three who went to church every Sunday. But where they overlapped was their shared desire to become fabulously wealthy. After working together for a little while at LG Tech and doing quite well for themselves, they realized they could actually make a lot more money if they left LG Tech and formed their own lead generation business. And so in early 2009, they did just that. They left LG Tech and they formed a new company called 800 Exchange. And right away, it took off, generating millions and millions of dollars in revenue, 80% of which was profit. During this incredible time, Chris used some of his money to buy a brand new Range Rover and a beautiful condo in Laguna Beach, and he fell in love with this beautiful ballet dancer named Erica. By and large, Chris seemed to be putting his roots down and really building a life for himself. As for Ed, despite his squeaky clean outward appearance as being this all-star family man and father, he was using his cash to party and gamble in Las Vegas. When Ed was at LG Tech, he would regularly go to Las Vegas to generate business. And while he was there, he developed a gambling addiction. When he and Chris formed 800 Exchange, Ed continued to go to Las Vegas to drum up business. It was something he was good at. But when he and Chris started making money hand over fist, his gambling addiction grew tenfold and he went completely off the rails. Ed was spending so much money in Las Vegas, sometimes up to 6 figures an hour, that one of the main casinos there would fly him in their private jet out to Las Vegas and they would put him in their very best suite, fully comped. It's unclear how aware Chris was of Ed's crazy spending habits because Chris rarely went to Las Vegas with Ed. The men were living their respective dreams until October of that year when Ed was charged with embezzlement. Their former employer, LG Tech, had alleged that Ed had siphoned off about $2.5 million from their business to fund his wild Las Vegas lifestyle. Ed told Chris these allegations were totally false, but Chris was shaken. He was worried that if he didn't do something about this, Ed could potentially embezzle money from 800 Exchange. And so Chris went out and got a lawyer to begin protecting himself from his business partner. Over the following few months, Ed and Chris attempted to run 800 Exchange before Ed's trial date, but it was just too difficult because the trust had been totally destroyed by these allegations. And in May of 2010, Ed was convicted of felony embezzlement. In order to avoid jail time, Ed had taken a deal that meant he would need to pay roughly $800,000 of restitution to LG Tech. But Ed did not have $800,000. The only way he could make this payment would be if 800 Exchange, the business, fronted the money. But in order to do that, he would need Chris to sign off that he was okay with that because he owned half of the business. When Ed approached Chris said, "No, I'm not signing that. I'm worried you're going to take advantage of me too." But after a couple of weeks of talking to his lawyer, Chris finally told Ed that he was ready to meet up with him and come to some sort of agreement. And so on June 4th, the two men met up at the 800 Exchange office, and Chris decided to just sell his portion of the business to Ed for about $1 million, and then Ed can do whatever he needs to do with the business account to pay down his debts. Despite how crazy this situation was, Chris actually felt like this was kind of a win for him. He got a $1 million payday, and now he wanted to go out and celebrate. And so a couple of days after this meeting with Ed, Chris emails his family and says he's going to go on a 3-week vacation to South America and just go surfing the whole time. He's chartered this 45-foot yacht. He's hired a captain. He's hired a cook. It's going to be this dream vacation. He also regretted to inform them that he had broken it off with his girlfriend Erica, but he had a new girlfriend who'd be coming with him on this vacation, and she was a former Playboy playmate named Tiffany. His family was really surprised to hear the news about Erica because they really believed they were going to get married. But the trip itself was not really out of character. Chris had always said for the longest time that once he made it big and had millions of dollars in cash, he would just sail off into the Pacific and go surfing and just be off the grid and live his life in peace. And now he finally had a chance to do that. And so his family said, "Have fun, stay safe, and we'll see you when you get back." But 3 weeks went by and Chris did not return to his condo. Instead, he emailed his family again and just told them he was having this great time, that this was the best trip he could have asked for, and that instead of coming home, he was just going to keep sailing around the world and enjoying this time that he is disconnected from society. And again, his family said, okay, have a good time, stay safe, and we'll see you when we see you. But over the following weeks and months that Chris extended this vacation, his emails took a dark turn. Chris started to act depressed and he alluded to taking drugs, and then at one point he talked about doing the unthinkable, referencing harming himself. His parents were very concerned and told him he should come back home, or at the very least, they should arrange to meet up somewhere. But every time they said this, Chris would just suddenly change the tone of his email and seem really upbeat and cheerful and said, oh no, I'm actually just fine and I just need some time to myself. Finally, in December of 2010, so 6 months after Chris has gone on this vacation, he reaches out to his brother Paul and asks him if he'll come to Costa Rica the following February to go surfing with him. Paul was excited and said he would go, and he and the rest of his family breathed a collective sigh of relief that now one of their family members would get to see Chris and actually check in on him. Shortly after this email exchange, Chris told his family that he was headed off into the Congo to sell some gold coins to a trader who was prepared to buy them at a 30% markup, and Chris was really excited about it. After this, there were no more emails. The family was concerned that this gold buyer potentially had kidnapped or hurt Chris, but Chris was going long periods of time between his emails to family, and so they figured, you know what, Paul's trip to Costa Rica where he's going to meet up with Chris is coming right up, so let's hold off doing anything drastic until then. But when February of 2011 rolled around and it was time for Paul to fly out to Costa Rica to meet up with Chris, before Paul left, he called the hotel in Costa Rica to confirm the reservations Chris had supposedly made. And the hotel said, we've never heard of Chris Smith. There are no reservations under his name. And so Paul tried to contact Chris, but to no avail. And so Paul told his family about it, and they decided it was best for Paul not to go to Costa Rica because probably Chris wasn't there. And the family instead got in touch with the State Department and asked them if they could help them find their son, their brother. And right away, the State Department discovered Chris's passport had never left the United States. And his family said that was impossible because for the past year, Chris has been sailing around the world. But the State Department said, this is what we got. So Chris's dad, who used to be a cop, drove out to California to speak to Ed, who was the last person to see Chris before he left on this vacation. And Ed would say he has no idea where Chris is. However, he did say Chris had a fake passport, and that might be why his passport was not showing up as leaving the country. Chris's father didn't really know what to make of this information, and so he decided it would be best to just file a missing person report and put the investigation in the hands of the police. Shortly after the report was filed, the police brought Ed in for questioning, and Ed reiterated that he didn't know where Chris was and that he did have this fake passport, and he also said that they had not ended on good terms. They were kind of fighting and bickering at the end, and that's why he hadn't heard from Chris since he left. Ed was cooperative and didn't really have much to give police, and so the police let him go. While the police hit dead end after dead end in this missing person case, the property manager of the office building where the 800 Exchange business had been located was growing increasingly frustrated. Shortly after Chris had sold his portion of the business to Ed and then gone on this vacation, Ed had moved 800 Exchange from that office building to another, and Ed had not paid his final rent, which was $40,000. And this property manager had repeatedly tried to get in touch with Ed, but Ed was totally blowing him off. One day, the property manager was griping about Ed and his delinquent payment to another tenant in the office building, a guy by the name of Joe DeLue, who just happened to be a private investigator. And during this discussion, the manager was saying that not only had Ed not made this payment, but he had also been recently questioned by police about his missing business partner who was still missing. And so Joe is immediately intrigued by this, and he says to the manager, you know, it sounds like Ed is a pretty shady guy. Would it be possible for me to just poke my head around their old space now that it's vacant? Because you never know, there could be something in there. And so the manager said that was fine. He opened the door to the old 800 Exchange space. Joe walked inside and immediately found blood spatter on the door frame of where Chris's office used to be. He also found blood spatter on the ceiling and on the walls. And so Joe called the police, who showed up and sprayed luminol all over Chris's office, and there was blood everywhere. It would turn out Chris didn't sell his portion of the business to Ed. On that day, June 4th, 2010, Chris did go into the office to try to reach some agreement with Ed, but when he walked in, Ed promptly killed him with a knife or some other blunt object. Then he, or someone he hired, dumped Chris's body somewhere. After that, Ed stole all of Chris's money to pay off the debt to LG Tech, as well as some other large debts in Las Vegas. And then after that, Ed hijacked Chris's email accounts and pretended to be Chris for almost an entire year. Chris never took a boating trip around the world. He never broke up with Erica and had this new girlfriend from Playboy. He just got killed inside of his office, and Ed created this ridiculous, elaborate lie that was designed to make his family believe that Chris had become unstable and that maybe he did end his own life, or maybe he did get kidnapped or killed in the Congo. Ed was just trying to create that seed of doubt that he had anything to do with it. But in 2018, it all came crashing down for Ed when a jury convicted him of killing Chris and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, Ed maintains his innocence, and to this day, Ed still will not give up where Chris's body is. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to babysit the Like Button's kids and immediately fill them up with candy and soda, and then send them home with whoopee cushions and whistles. On May 23, 2011, a 26-year-old woman named Jamie Miner was working at a fancy restaurant in Austin, Texas. That night, something seemed to come over Jamie, and she began acting erratic, according to her coworkers. So erratic, in fact, that her boss told her she had to go home. And so some of Jamie's coworkers decided they would call one of her friends to come pick her up because they were concerned Jamie could not get home under her own power. But it would later turn out that when that friend showed up at the restaurant to get Jamie, Jamie wasn't there. And so the friend tried calling Jamie and looking for Jamie, but she was nowhere to be found. When the next day Jamie had still not come home, Jamie's friends and family began calling around and asking if anybody knew where she was, but no one seemed to know. And so the parents filed a missing person report and then began putting up flyers all over Austin in hopes that someone would recognize her and call in with some information. But over the next several weeks, after the police have launched their own search, no one came forward with any information about Jamie. Then on June 29th, so 37 days after Jamie has gone missing, a worker found some of Jamie's personal belongings inside of a parking garage about a half-mile away from Jamie's restaurant. This discovery prompted police to pull the surveillance footage not only from the parking garage, but from neighboring businesses. And what they saw on all of this footage was on the night Jamie was supposed to be getting picked up by her friend, she instead shows up on camera trying to get in the side door of a steakhouse located right next to that parking garage. The steakhouse was called Perry's, and Jamie used to work there. So Jamie tries the side door, it doesn't work, so she makes her way into the parking garage and tries a door on the back of the restaurant, but that also doesn't work. Then, for reasons no one fully understands, Jamie made her way up to the third floor of this parking garage, where she managed to pull off the cover to this huge air duct and then climbed inside. This air duct did eventually connect down to the steakhouse Perry's on the first floor, but in order to get down there, you would need to navigate these very tight and steep sections of pipe, and the inside of this air duct gets to be over 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The security footage only showed Jamie climbing into the duct. They didn't have footage of her leaving the duct. So the police made their way over to Perry's and this parking garage, and they get inside the air duct and they find Jamie. She had managed to climb through the ducts from the third floor all the way down to the section of duct that was between the first floor and the second floor. There, she had tried to go down this very steep section of pipe, and after getting to the bottom of it, she could not make the tight turn through the pipe. Her body just could not contort around the turn. But unfortunately, going back up it was impossible. It was too steep, it was too narrow, and there's nothing to grab onto. Jamie almost certainly began screaming for help, but the section of pipe she got stuck in was located in a building just off of the parking garage that was more or less abandoned, and so no one would have heard her. It's unclear how long Jamie was alive inside of that air duct, but eventually she died of hyperthermia, or overheating. While no one knows for sure why Jamie acted the way she did on the night she went missing, it was determined in her toxicology report that she had LSD in her liver. LSD is a very powerful hallucinogenic. During a busy 2009 weekend on a popular river in Florida, two boats collided. Within minutes, one of them, a 40-foot long pleasure craft, had sank. Luckily, all the passengers on both boats survived, but unluckily, where the sunk boat finally landed underwater was not very deep, and it was just barely outside of a main shipping channel, which meant if it didn't get moved, someone was eventually going to run into it. The marina owner contacted a local commercial diver and asked him if he would come out and lift this boat up and move it, but that diver was not going to be available for several weeks, and he was asking for too much money. So the marina owner reached out to another local diver, a guy by the name of Tim, and offered him the job. Tim was not a commercial diver. He was a 43-year-old recreational diver who was well known in the area and had lots of diving experience. But in terms of experience lifting 40-foot crafts off the bottom of the river, Tim had no experience. But Tim was excited at this challenge being presented to him, and so he accepted the deal and offered to do it for half the money the commercial diver was asking for. Even though Tim had never raised a boat before, he knew it was going to require a lot of lift bags around the boat. Lift bags are like these big, durable balloons that you can inflate and deflate underwater. But before Tim could just go down and start placing these bags, he needed to do a survey dive where he just went down and checked out the wreckage, saw it for himself, and figured out how many lift bags he would need and where he would place them. So on September 12th, Tim threw all of his dive gear into his truck, he left the marina and drove over to a parking lot that butted up against the shipping channel. Tim hopped out, leaving his gear in the truck. He walked down to the edge of the riverbank and he scanned out across the river looking for the buoy that the marina owner had told him was out there, designating where the shipwreck was. Once he found it and saw that it was not very far from where he was, he just walked back up to his truck, grabbed his gear, came back down to the water's edge. He jocked up, then hopped in the water and swam out to the buoy. Once he was there, he placed his diver down flag on the buoy. This is a flag that signifies to anybody in the area that there is a diver below them, and then he made his descent. Tim didn't expect to be underwater for very long, and because he was a very experienced diver, he probably thought this dive was going to be extremely routine. And so for those reasons, he had elected not to bring a dive partner with him. This is a huge no-no in the diving community, especially if you're going to be diving in a hazardous environment like a shipwreck. But Tim was confident, so he broke that rule. One of the pieces of gear that Tim had brought with him was a diver propulsion vehicle, or DPV for short. These DPVs come in all shapes and sizes, but what you should picture in your head is like a little torpedo with a propeller on the back, and the diver holds on to this torpedo and controls the speed using a throttle, and basically just rockets around underwater. The current in the river that Tim was going to be in was fairly strong, and so Tim brought his DPV to help him stay near the shipwreck as he inspected it. After Tim went subsurface, he grabbed a scooter and began going straight down, and the water was not very clear, so he couldn't see the shipwreck at first. But after going down about 50 feet, he saw this beautiful boat. It was perched on its side on this fairly steep embankment with its nose pointing in the direction the current was flowing. Right away, Tim got to work swimming around the shipwreck, looking for different points on the boat where he could attach lift bags and marking those locations on his diver slate, which is like a dry erase board. But after going around the boat several times, Tim had not seen the actual impact site on the side of the boat that caused it to sink in the first place, and he wondered if it was hidden on the side of the boat that was laying in the sand. And so Tim decided he wanted to go down and have a look, and so he went down to where the sand met the boat, but as soon as he got down there, he kicked up all the mud and the sand and it killed his visibility. And so he grabbed onto the side of the boat and he picked up his DPV and turned it on with the propellers pointed back towards where the mud and the sand was, and he kind of used the propellers of the DPV like a leaf blower and blew the mud and sand out of his field of vision. And it worked great, but he couldn't see the impact site. And so he got underneath the boat and got closer and closer to where the actual metal of the boat was pressing up against the sand and just continued to blow away the mud and sand to get a better look, when all of a sudden the ship lurched forward and came to a stop on Tim's legs. He couldn't move, he was totally trapped. When Tim had used his DPV to clear away the mud and sand, he had also blown away some of the mud and sand that was keeping the boat from sliding farther down the embankment. And so when it got blown away, the boat became unsteady and it came to rest on top of Tim. When Tim was not able to pull his legs out from under this incredibly heavy boat, he most likely used the DPV to continue to erode the mud and sand around the boat to try to get it to continue to slide down off of his legs. But he wasn't able to do that because the boat was basically wedged up against his legs. Tim's legs were the thing keeping the boat from sliding any farther. And because Tim did not bring a dive partner, there was literally no one there to save him. And even though he had told the marina owner that he was going out to survey the wreck, he had not given his timeline, so no one was expecting him. And so he would have realized very quickly that there was virtually nothing he could do but wait to die. Several hours later, someone on the surface noticed Tim's diver down flag on that buoy and called in the authorities. When the fire department's dive team went down to the wreckage, they found Tim. He was still trapped underneath the boat. He had run out of air and he had drowned. From a young age, Carrie O'Connor had an intense love of learning. When she learned how to read, her parents had to bribe her to get her to put her book down so she would go outside and play with the other kids. While Carrie loved to learn about all things, her favorite subject was French culture. And so she began devouring all things French, and then in middle school she began studying the language, and by high school she was nearly fluent and taking college-level French courses. Carrie would go on to earn several degrees in French, including a PhD. And in 2019, she put that PhD to use when she was offered a full-time professorship at Boston University. She eagerly accepted the role. After her first full year at BU, she decided it was time to get an apartment that was closer to campus. So in August of 2020, shortly after Carrie's 38th birthday, she, along with her two beloved cats, moved just 10 minutes away from Boston University into an old apartment building on a busy street. With her apartment still filled with unopened moving boxes and furniture wrapped in plastic, Carrie broke out her laptop and enthusiastically wrote an email to all of her students for the year titled The Joy of Learning French. In it, her students saw her passion for the French language and how excited she was about the upcoming academic year. A few weeks later, on Monday, September 14th, Carrie was back at her apartment building after classes, and she had just purchased a brand new piece of furniture that she wanted to haul up to her apartment. This piece of furniture was not actually assembled. All the parts and the directions were inside of this box that was 7 feet tall, 1 foot wide, and weighed just under 80 pounds. And so Carrie got this huge box out of her car at street level and then hauled it all the way through the front doors of her apartment building into the first floor lobby, where she leaned it up against the wall and then pressed the call button for the elevator. To understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of how Carrie's elevator worked. Once the elevator car arrived on your floor, you would slide open this big door called the hoistway door. And on the other side, you would see the elevator car, and on the car itself would be yet another door. This door is called the car gate. This metal accordion-style door would also be slid to the side manually, but unlike the hoistway door, the car gate had to be shut all the way in order for the elevator to move between floors. So when the light dinged in the first floor lobby above Carrie's head, she opened up the hoistway door, and then she reached inside and slid open the car gate, and then she grabbed her package and began trying to push it inside of the elevator car. The only way it looked like she could fit this huge package inside of the elevator was if she got it in there at an angle standing up. But no matter how hard she pushed and pulled on it, she just could not get it to go inside. And so while Carrie's doing this, another tenant happened to walk in the front doors of the apartment building, and they saw Carrie struggling, and at first he just walked past Carrie and started going up the stairs towards his own apartment, but he stopped and he turned and he just said to Carrie, "Hey, I don't think it's a good idea to keep doing what you're doing. That package looks like it's too heavy to be on that elevator. The elevator's really old and you might trip a sensor and it might start moving before you're ready. You know, we've had problems with that elevator before. It's just not worth the risk." And so Carrie, who's already pretty committed to doing this, she hesitates for a second and just kind of looks at her package. Then she looks up at the guy and says, "You know what? I'm just going to try one more time to get it inside the elevator." And so Carrie goes back to trying to get it on, and this other tenant hesitates for a second and then decides, okay, I'll help her do it. And so he goes down and he holds open the hoistway door with his hand, and Carrie goes inside of the elevator car and she uses her hip to keep open the car gate. And the two of them begin pushing and pulling, and finally they're able to wedge this package at an angle inside of the elevator car. And so Carrie thanks the guy and he says no problem. He turns and walks up the stairs and he disappears. Once he was gone, Carrie didn't press any of the floor buttons. Instead, she tried to close the car gate over the top of her package. But at the same time, a maintenance worker in the floor below her, which was the basement, hit the call button for the elevator. Unbeknownst to Carrie, the top of her huge package, when they wedged it inside, had pressed up against the sensor at the top of the door frame that registers when the car gate has shut. And so when the maintenance worker pressed the call button, because that package was pressing on the sensor, it tricked the elevator into thinking the gate was shut and secured, and now it was time to move. And so the car began to go down, but it only made it a couple of feet before the movement caused the package to slip off of the sensor, causing the elevator to stop. Carrie was most likely very confused how this car would have moved, considering the car gate was still wide open, but she had bigger problems. She was now trapped between the first floor lobby and the basement. But she didn't panic. Instead, she decided she would just get her package back inside the elevator car, and then she would figure out what to do next. The package, when it came off that sensor, had fallen forward and was basically jutting out of the elevator. So the top half of it was in the first floor lobby, propped up against the floor of the first floor lobby. And so Carrie turned around so her back was facing outside of the elevator, and she got down in a squatting position underneath her package, so her shoulder was up against the package, and then she began pressing it up as hard as she could until she managed to press the package back inside of the car. But again, the top of that package made contact with that sensor that registers whether that gate is shut, and so believing it was shut and secure, the elevator began moving down again. And this time, Carrie, whose back is to the opening of the elevator, she lost her balance and fell backwards out of the elevator into that narrow space between the outside of the elevator and the inside of the elevator shaft. Now, if the elevator had not been moving, she probably could have just crawled back up into the elevator, but unfortunately, her package this time did not slip off the sensor. And so the elevator still believed the gate was shut, and so it kept on moving down. And so as soon as Carrie fell into this narrow space, the movement of the elevator would have kind of sucked her up into that space, crushing her up against the inside of the elevator shaft wall as the car forces its way down past her towards the basement. But the car doesn't even get to the basement. It stops once Carrie is pinned perfectly between the elevator and the elevator shaft walls. When the fire department finally arrived, it was too late. Carrie was already deceased. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please politely ask the like button to give you a ride home. And when they say yes, instead of sitting in the front seat, sit directly behind them and then proceed to violently kick the back of their seat the whole ride, periodically asking if you're there yet. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese famously attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military base in Hawaii. But Pearl Harbor was not the only U.S. base attacked by the Japanese that month. In fact, just hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese shifted gears and attacked U.S. military personnel on Wake Island, which is a coral atoll in the northern Pacific Ocean. After 2 weeks of fighting, the Japanese had taken Wake Island from the Americans, and they sent the majority of American military personnel and American civilian contractors to prisoner of war camps in Asia. But they retained 98 of these POWs to stay on the island and fortify defenses. Over the next couple of years, the Americans would periodically bomb Wake Island, but there was never any concerted effort to take it back from the Japanese. However, that all changed on October 5th, 1943, when the Americans decided it was time to take it back. They launched a huge air raid on the island that was so violent, the Japanese admiral on Wake Island was convinced a full-scale invasion was imminent. And so in his paranoia, he ordered the 98 POWs they had retained on the island to be executed. And so they marched these 98 POWs to the edge of the sea, they blindfolded them, and then they gunned them down. But in the chaos of the air raid and the execution, one of the American POWs somehow managed to escape. After the Japanese had left the area, this POW snuck back down to the execution site, and he carved into the rock a memorial for all 98 of the POWs. So he was including himself in that number because I'm sure he knew he would eventually be recaptured. This was a small area and he was the only American there. And sure enough, this POW was recaptured that day and he was personally executed by the Japanese admiral. The identity of this POW has never been determined. After the war ended, the Japanese admiral that ordered these executions was tried for war crimes, found guilty, and put to death himself. The so-called 98 Rock can still be seen on Wake Island today. On January 25th, 1998, American tourists Tom and Eileen Lonergan boarded a boat in Queensland, Australia. The married couple was from Louisiana. Tom was 34 and Eileen was 28. They had spent the last 2 years in Fiji and Tuvalu serving in the Peace Corps. Australia was just a pit stop on their way back home. They both were avid scuba divers and they wanted a chance to dive on the world's largest coral reef system, the Great Barrier Reef. Once Tom, Eileen, and the other 24 tourists had boarded this boat, the captain did a head head count, and then once he had everyone, he turned the boat around and headed out to sea. After traveling 25 miles, the captain stopped the boat and then told the group to put on their dive gear. So Tom, Eileen, and the others happily put on their fins and their masks and their tanks, and then when they were ready, they were inspected and then allowed to jump into the Coral Sea. Less than an hour later, the divers came back up to the surface and the captain began pulling them back into the boat. Once everyone was back on board the boat, the captain did another head count just to confirm he had everyone, and once he was sure he did, he turned the boat around and he headed back to shore. Except the captain miscounted, and neither he nor anyone else noticed. Shortly after the boat had left the area, Tom and Eileen Lonergan came up from their dive and looked around and realized they had been abandoned. After the initial panic wore off, they probably told each other that don't worry, as soon as that boat gets back to shore, they will find inside the boat our wallets and passports and other personal items, and they'll know we aren't with them and they'll come out and get us. And so most likely the couple was fairly optimistic as they just treaded water waiting for someone to show up any minute. Except they didn't show up any minute. It took 48 hours before anybody showed up, because that's how long it took before someone saw their wallets and passports and personal items were still inside that dive boat. And in those 48 hours, Tom and Eileen were exposed to intense summer heat, no fresh water, and sharks. When their personal effects were finally found, a huge search was launched for them, but there was no sign of them. A month later, a female wetsuit washed up on the shores of Australia, and it was the same size as Eileen's, and an expert analyzed it and said it had been floating in the water for about a month. So that lined up with when Tom and Eileen went missing. 5 months later, more diving equipment washed up on the shores of Australia. Among those items were life jackets with the Lonergan name stenciled on the back of them, as well as an air tank and a dive fin that belonged to Eileen. But the most disturbing thing that washed up on shore was the couple's diver's slate. A diver's slate is like a dry erase board that works underwater. On this slate was the Lonergans' final message. It said, "To anyone who can help us, we've been abandoned on Agincourt Reef. Please help us before we die. Please help." Above the message was a date. It was January 26th, 1998. So that would have been one day after they were abandoned at sea. So we know the couple was alive for at least 24 hours. But beyond that, no one knows what happened. Some say the pair staged their disappearance so they could start a new life somewhere, or so they could take their own lives. Others say they were devoured by sharks. Most experts believe they eventually became delirious from the dehydration, and that would have caused them to willingly take off their diving equipment, and without that equipment, they wouldn't have been buoyant, and so at some point they couldn't have continued treading water, and they would have drowned. But regardless of which theory is correct, Tom and Eileen have never been found. Bryce Gillies was born in 1989 in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. From a young age, Bryce's parents knew he loved the outdoors, and so they signed him up for the Boy Scouts. And as a scout, Bryce learned, amongst many things, how to survive in the wilderness. And he would routinely put this training to the test by leaving his house and heading off to the nearby Appalachian Trail and hiking around sometimes up to 20 miles in a single day. Bryce ultimately became an Eagle Scout, which is the highest rank anybody can obtain inside of the Boy Scouts, a rank that only about 8% of scouts will ever reach. After he graduated from high school in 2007, Bryce decided he wanted to go to school out west. And during a visit to Northern Arizona University, Bryce fell in love with their school because all around their campus were these unbelievable hiking trails that were totally unlike anything he saw growing up on the East Coast. Bryce decided this was his dream school, so he applied, and a couple weeks later, he got accepted. He was totally thrilled. During his first couple of years at NAU, Bryce took full advantage of these totally amazing hiking trails within a couple hours of the campus. He also spent some time overseas in West Africa, helping to build a medical clinic for people in need. During the summer break of 2009, so going into his third year at NAU, Bryce was still living out in Arizona in an apartment, and he still had a few weeks before classes started. And so he decided he would head off to the nearby Grand Canyon to do a little bit of hiking. He had recently read in an outdoor magazine about this lesser known but unbelievable trail that was just for experts in the canyon that he wanted to try. It was called the Deer Creek Thunder River Loop, and it brought hikers to this remote location where water gushed out of this huge limestone rock wall, transforming the desert landscape below into this unbelievable green oasis. The article said very strong hikers could complete this nearly 28-mile loop in about 3 days. Since Bryce considered himself a very strong hiker, he decided this was perfect for him. Bryce called his parents and let them know he was going to do this loop and that when he came back in a couple of days, he'd be making a trip to Virginia to visit with them. Then Bryce called some friends in the area to see if they wanted to come with him on this hike, but no one was available, so Bryce decided he would go on his own. So the next day, which was Saturday, July 18th, Bryce loaded up his car and he began driving these several hours to the parking lot that was nearest the trailhead. Bryce parked his car, he got his gear out of the trunk, and then he set off down the trail. Bryce had not obtained a backcountry permit for this hike. This was a requirement for anybody doing an overnight out in the canyon, which Bryce planned on doing. Bryce also didn't file his route with the park rangers. Had he told them where he was going, they would have tried to talk him out of it. The Deer Creek Thunder River Loop had no protection from the sun the entire time, and since it was July, he would be hit with the highest temperatures and the most direct sunlight. All this on top of the fact that even in the coolest times of the year, this trail is still an extremely difficult trail because of the terrain you have to navigate. In fact, when hikers did file their route with park rangers and they indicated they were going to be doing this expert loop, they would ask them to provide next of kin information in case they died during their hike. It's unclear if Bryce was just very confident in himself and his abilities, or if he was being reckless. From his car, Bryce hiked about 2 miles down some switchbacks into the canyon. Once he reached the bottom, he would have found himself in this wide open flat area called the Esplanade that kind of looked like the surface of the moon with all these potholes all over it. At this point in Bryce's hike, it would have been dark out, so he would have set up his tent somewhere on the rocks and camped out for the night. People that have done this, that have camped out on the Esplanade, have said it's unbelievably beautiful because most people experience the Grand Canyon from high up on one of the rims looking down into it. But the Esplanade is literally inside the canyon, so you have this unobstructed view in both directions, and apparently it's quite beautiful. The next morning, Bryce got up at sunrise, he packed up his campsite, and then he continued on his hike. The first challenge he would come up against that morning was navigating down what's called the Red Wall, which is a fairly steep and treacherous descent that for an experienced hiker, it would take about an hour to safely navigate. And then at the bottom of the Red Wall, you would enter into this area called the Surprise Valley. No one really knows why it's named that, but hikers who have been down in this valley, they think it's named after the surprise you feel when you get in there and you realize how much hotter it is. Typically, it's about 10 or 20 degrees hotter down inside of this bowl. After Bryce successfully navigated down the Red Wall, he entered into this totally miserable Surprise Valley, but he would have known he was only about a half mile away from his target destination, the Deer Creek Thunder River, where he planned to jump in and cool off. So, eager to do that, Bryce took off, but made a critical mistake. He went the wrong way. While it's unclear exactly how this happened, experts believe his ears played a trick on him. Hikers are told as they're approaching this river in the middle of the desert, they should listen out for it, because when you get fairly close, you can hear the sound of rushing water. But hikers have to be careful because sometimes when the wind is blowing in a certain direction, that sound from the river will echo off the inside of this bowl and it will appear to come from the opposite direction. It's believed Bryce was following his map when he heard the sound of this river coming from a different direction, and so he abandoned the map and followed the sound. Bryce walked for quite a while in the wrong direction all the way up a hill, and most likely the whole time he was hearing the sound of the water, and he probably thought, once I get over the top of this hill, I'll look down the other side and I will see the water. But when he crested the hill, he looked down and just saw a barren valley. Had he continued another quarter mile down into the valley and then up the other side, he could have turned around and he would have been able to spot an obvious landmark that would have brought him to the river. But most likely, Bryce was exhausted from the extreme heat and the sunlight and trekking all this way, and so he felt like it was probably too risky to keep going down into this valley because he had no idea where it went. So in keeping with his wilderness training he got as a Boy Scout, he dropped all of his heavy equipment off the side of the trail in an area he had marked so he could eventually come back and retrieve it. And then he took his water, food, and headlamp, turned around, and began backtracking. After a little while, Bryce decided to abandon the trail and actually veer off onto a dry creek bed. In the Boy Scouts, they're taught any dry creek bed will eventually connect to water. And so at this point, Bryce is probably running low on water and figures whether this leads him to the Deer Creek Thunder River or some other water body, he didn't care. He just needed water. So off he went on this dry creek bed, but after a while, he saw less and less vegetation. It was just this barren desert in all directions. After a little while longer, Bryce dropped all of his gear on the ground after finishing his water. At this point, he would have known that if he doesn't find a water source soon, he won't make it. And so Bryce just continues to trudge along on this dry riverbed, not seeing any indication that he's getting any closer to water. But then he looks up and he sees the land in front of him appears to slope downward out of view. And then beyond that, he sees off in the distance what looks like the southern wall of the Grand Canyon. And below the southern wall is the Colorado River. And so Bryce would have known if he can just go down this decline, he's certain to reach this river and he'll be saved. And so Bryce made his way up to where the ground started going down towards the river, and he began safely descending fairly slowly, and then he reached a very steep section called a spill, which is a dry waterfall, and these vary in height, but they're pretty steep and they're pretty slick. Once Bryce went down one of these things, there'd be no way to get back up again. So this was a one-way trip. But Bryce was desperate. He knew his only chance was getting down to that Colorado River, which he could now see. And so Bryce scrambled down this first spill, and then he found another one, and he kept going down these spills, and they kept getting steeper and more challenging, and the temperature continued to rise as he went down deeper into this canyon. Finally, Bryce reached a spill that was very, very steep, and it was nearly vertical. But again, Bryce couldn't go back up the way he came. He had to keep going. So at some point, he threw himself off of the spill and he fell down 30 feet, but he lived. He stood up, he dusted himself off, and he continued walking forward. He walked past these boulders into this clearing, and right in front of him is the Colorado River. It's a half a mile straight down in front of him. But the only way to get to it was navigating another spill. And this spill was 80 feet tall, and it was almost completely vertical. There was no way to survive that kind of fall. And Bryce couldn't just turn around and try to find an alternate route because this was a one-way trip. He could not climb back up the spills he had just come down to get there. And to his left and to his right were these steep canyon walls that kind of bordered the space he was in that had no handholds on them, so he couldn't climb them up or down. Bryce was trapped, and he knew it. The following Tuesday, when Bryce was supposed to be home in Virginia visiting his family, he didn't show up. So his family tried calling him, but they couldn't get through to him. It seemed like his phone was off, and so they called the authorities. A search party was sent out in the Grand Canyon to go look for Bryce, and on Saturday, July 25th, so this is 6 days after Bryce has found himself trapped on that ledge overlooking the river, a search party was on the Colorado River, and they happened to look up in the direction where Bryce had been, and they noticed what looked like a person, and so they got their climbing gear, and they made their way up that spill onto this ledge, and they found Bryce. He was sitting up against a boulder, and he was deceased. He had died from heat stroke and dehydration. In his hand was his BlackBerry cell phone. It wouldn't have had any service inside of the canyon, but Bryce used it as a notepad to write a final message to his family and to his friends. In it, he writes, "Life is good whether it is long or short. I was fortunate to do much more than most people, and for that I am very thankful." His message also had some humor thrown into it. He said to his family that he was really thankful he had his BlackBerry phone because it would have been a lot harder to etch his final message into a rock. He also said that he didn't know what the afterlife held for him, he just hoped they had water. Then, with his phone's battery dying, he wrote one final sentence. "I feel like going into the wild is a calling we all feel. Some answer it, and some die for it." Then, shortly after writing that message, Bryce clutched his phone to his chest and he passed away. He was just 20 years old. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's salted butter with unsalted butter.